Okay, perhaps we can look to make a start in this afternoon's workshop. You will have noticed that I'm not Mrs. Gressler. Mrs. Gressler has been delayed, but hopefully she will be joining us around 3:30. Until then, I'll chair the workshop. I'm supposed to give a few opening remarks, so I'll keep my remarks brief. I just wanted to say that colleagues will be aware that every year, certainly for the last 7 years, the European Parliament has refused to grant discharge to the Council. And I think the European Parliament and the Budget Control Committee in particular feel very strongly about this. We do believe we are the discharge authority, and therefore we have the right and the responsibility to grant discharge or not to all institutions and EU bodies. And of course there is the question for us of transparency as well. We think it's important that all EU institutions are open and transparent about their accounts, and the Budget Control Committee, the Parliament and indeed the public in general have the right to have access to the accounts of the institution. So we believe it hasn't been good that for 7 years the discharge has not been granted. We don't believe it's good for the European Union. It doesn't do our reputation any good at all when people see that there is this perceived lack of transparency and that there is a lack of cooperation between two major institutions, the Council and the European Parliament. Therefore, the Budget Control Committee in particular feels that we should try and find a solution to this issue. I understand in the past workshops have been held on this. I think the last one maybe back in 2011, 2012. But no solution was found then, and I know the Council has made some suggestions as well in the past, but we've made no progress in terms of finding a full solution to this particular problem. Therefore, the Budget Control Committee felt now would be another good time to organise a workshop to discuss the issue, because certainly from our point of view, we are very keen to find a solution. So our rapporteur for the issue is Mr. Bart Stars, who's alongside me here. So I'm hoping some wise words as usual from Mr. Stars, and I am hoping that today's workshop will allow us to have some ideas and to make some progress on this issue. So hopefully we can start and finish the workshop with some optimism that we do feel that at last that some light has been shed on the issue and we can find a solution. So those are just a few opening remarks from myself, and I will pass over to Mr. Stars for his contribution.
Dank u, voorzitter. Heel kort.
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman. Just to say a warm word of welcome to everyone, and simply to repeat what discharge is. What is discharge? It means that citizens, or rather taxpayers, one way or another, can have the guarantee that the money that they have been contributing to the EU's coffers is then being used and spent in a proper way. The discharge exercises in recent years have really extended, have expanded, have grown into something else. The question is being asked, has the money been spent properly in terms of the provisions contained in the financial regulation, but also are citizens getting value for money? Is there an added value? And we are in a rather unfortunate position, as Mr. Vaughan has just reminded us, that it's not exactly a conflict, but there is a kind of dispute. We are locked in a dispute with Council because for 7 years they have been unable to get discharge because there have been differences of opinion between Council and Parliament about how the discharge should be conducted. And the way in which the Council is dispersing its resources, its money. And this conflict has been rumbling on for many years now. And as the studies, as the authors of the studies who we're going to be listening to have said, in those studies, in one of them, in one of their contributions, they say that there are general principles such as transparency and sound financial management. Concepts sometimes which are set out explicitly in the treaty provisions, and the authors of the studies say quite clearly those are principles which we have to steer by, and it's incumbent on us to have a strict interpretation of the balance between two important institutions such as the Parliament and the Council. And there's a need now for improved, enhanced cooperation between the two institutions, and I'm very happy to see that this meeting has been organised. The Parliament itself has financed the two studies which are now are going to be presented to us, and this I think sends out a signal. The message to the Council is that we are open for debate, and both Mrs Gressler as Chair and myself, in preparation for the first discharge round, we had our discussions with the Secretary General of the Council, and the impression I had was that there was also an openness on that side as well. They were waiting for us, expecting us to put a proposal to Council, one which needed to fulfil certain criteria in the Council's thinking, and the Secretary General of Council ensured us that provided those criteria were met, they were fulfilled, they would make a proposal to the Coreper saying, can we possibly hammer out some kind of modus operandi or a modus vivendi. So this hearing is a public exercise so that we can discuss the subjects and the issues which are involved. We have a very eminent group of speakers coming to talk to us, and we're going to be listening very closely to what they have to say. We also have an intergroup, which is really a working group, cross-group, different groups in the Parliament are represented on that. And then next week and the week after that in Strasbourg, I myself as rapporteur, together with Mrs Gressler as rapporteur, as chairman of CONT, will be sitting down with the group leaders, group representatives, to see if we can come up with a text which will then need to be further discussed and titivated in the Budget Control Committee, so that when we get to the second round of discharge, we've already had the initial round end of March, April. That was round one in the discharge procedure, and now we're looking forward to the second round in October. And I hope that there will be agreement in principle by that time, so that the discharge for next year, which will be the responsibility of my successor, that round will proceed in a smooth way, and that we'll get a proper exchange of information. And the sole purpose of this exercise is to be able to tell the taxpayer exactly how the money is being spent. So I have got great expectations about this afternoon and the workshop. I have gone through the studies very, very carefully, but this will also give us an opportunity to ask our questions. And I think it seems to me that this is going to stand us in good stead in Parliament and also, I think, in Council. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bart, for those opening remarks.
Děkuji za tyto úvodní poznámky. Ta první prezentace se nazývá Demokratická odpovědnost za rozpočet Rady. Prezentovat budou 3 doktoři. Benedetto z Univerzity Londýn, Rinaldi z CEPS a doktor Aden z Berlínské vysoké školy ekonomické a právní. Já nejprve dám slovo doktoru Benedettovi. Děkuji, pane předsedo. Děkuji tomuto výboru za pozvání. My si uvědomujeme, že za posledních 10 let je toto oblast určitého napětí pro tento výbor a i mezi institucemi, tedy parlamentem a radou. Za posledních 10 let parlament odmítl udělit absolutorium radě z řady důvodů a mezi nimi, protože rada plně nezodpověděla dotazník parlamentu, co se týče jeho vnitřního účetnictví a vnitřního řízení. I když rada plně spolupracovala s účetním dvorem, který vypracovává výroční zprávu. Parlament je znepokojen nejen tím, jak se nakládá s finančními prostředky, ale o to zde především nejde. Především běží o to, jakým způsobem rada provádí své politiky bez správního
to executive activities. So the Council is not exclusively a legislature like the European Parliament. It is also, at least in part, an executive. And the question is to the extent to which funds therein are used for executive activities. In recent years, a modus vivendi was discussed or was on the table between the two institutions, but it wasn't taken forward, a way to update a pre-existing agreement from the 1970s known as the Gentleman's Agreement for the Budget. And in this briefing, what we want to do is to propose solutions and strategies for the Parliament. So, first of all, it's useful to illustrate the frequency with which the Parliament has asked questions on an annual basis concerning the financial years up until 2013. Questions of this nature were not asked, as far as I can recall, for 2015, where the questions beforehand were much more specific. And what we see, first of all, is during the period just after the Lisbon Treaty was coming, or at the time that the Lisbon Treaty was coming into effect, the European External Action Service was established in the few years following that, and the High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy was relocated with her staff from the Council to the External Action Service. So there was a significant institutional change within the Council. Some of its foreign policy responsibilities were lost to this new institution, the External Action Service. Some aspects of foreign policy, we assume, were retained within the Council, and some new executive responsibilities were added to the mix due to the Lisbon Treaty because of the creation of the office of President of the European Council. And so those few questions for the financial years of 2009, 2010, some of which were aimed at that relocation of staff towards the EES, whether it's European Union special representatives, how many staff posts were allocated to the special representatives, and how those posts were divided between the Council and the External Action Service. And then when we see that the number of staff in external actions still within the Council was the subject of questions between 2010 and 2013. Some questions also on CSDP operations or their administration within the Council and the costs of those. Travel costs for the staff of European Union Special Representatives. And a more particular question for 2011 about what costs concerned with the CSDP and the CFSP were transferred into the External Action Service. So these are administrative questions, but they have an executive focus rather than a purely legislative focus, since traditionally we see foreign policy as part of the responsibilities of the executive. Then some questions about that one-off establishment of the External Action Service. To what extent, for 2011, was the creation of the External Action Service taken into account in the budget? Why wasn't it budgeted for in the budget of 2011? More details were requested about the reallocation of the Council's budget to the new budget for the new institution, Section 10, which was represented by the External Action Service. So these are the sorts of questions that the Parliament has been asking, and none of these questions have been explicitly replied to because over the years since 2009, the Council has not been replying to Parliament's annual questionnaire. And indeed, in 2013, the Parliament specifically asked the Council to answer all unanswered questions since 2010. So the Parliament has rejected the discharges for all financial years since 2009. It's currently considering the case of the 2015 budget. And the reasons in its resolutions for rejection have included the following in the next two slides. First of all, and most commonly, that the Council should be scrutinised in its expenditure like all other institutions. All other institutions respond to the Parliament's questionnaire. And that the Council has failed to provide what the Parliament regards as a sufficient budgetary documentation. There's been a concern about the principle of ramassage, which is forward spending on the construction of buildings. It's concerned with buildings policy. This may not look immediately like an executive responsibility, but if executive-type meetings are going to be held in new buildings, or the facilities of the Council are being used for executive responsibilities, there's a question about the proportion of the buildings policy that we could judge to be for executive usage. There was a short-term problem which had been identified by the Court of Auditors for 2011 on procurement. And the further concerns for the year 2011 included a lack of performance indicators for travel, logistics and interpretation. That's concerned with internal management. And again, travel, logistics and interpretation can be used for executive activities, not purely for legislative activities. And in more recent years, for 2013 and 2014, the Parliament the Council, I beg your pardon, it was the Council, did not provide an analysis of the demography of its members of staff, by which we mean matters concerned with gender, disability and other indicators, the extent to which there'd been a demographic census of members of staff, which was within norms of modern financial or personnel management. And finally, no apparent internal rules on integrity and conflicts of interests. At this point, I'll now hand over to my colleague, Hartmut Arden.
Yeah, thank you also from my side for inviting us for this workshop on a very interesting topic. So we already heard from Mr. Staes and also in his introduction that this is not a new topic, but that this is going back to the 1970s already. And this is also, I think, interesting when we look at this today, because we found that probably things have changed since then. The starting point in 1970 was that just the system of own resources had been invented and established. The Parliament only started to gain a role in this process. So this was a completely different situation, and also the powers of the Council were completely different compared to today, because at that time the Council was still rather a legislative body compared to today, and only then with a thing that evolved in the 1990s after the Treaty of Maastricht. The Council gained powers in a number of new fields and areas, so we listed them here on this slide. Of course, with the establishment of the European Council, but then also with the two intergovernmental fields that were established with the Treaty of Maastricht and that have now been integrated into the broader EU framework since the Treaty of Lisbon. This all means that the Council has become not only more powerful as a player, but especially more powerful as a player with executive tasks. And therefore, we think that indeed it is time to rethink all these issues in the context of the changed historical framework today. And this is then also very much related to the legal conflicts behind that. In the previous workshop that you held here on this issue 5 years ago now, indeed there was a clear controversy between the legal experts at that time, some of them thinking, okay, that the Council has a right to refuse accountability, and others thought, no, the Council should be in the same way accountable as everybody. We argue now in our paper that this has to be reconsidered against the historical changes that we have had since then, and that it is therefore time now to rethink also these legal issues. The remaining problem, and also the other team will talk about that, the remaining problem is that there is ambiguity in the wording of the legal provisions already in the treaty provisions, but also in the financial regulation, and at the end only your own rules are quite clear about the discharge, saying that the Council is just another institution and therefore has to report to the Parliament in the same way as others. So probably some of the solutions in the future will therefore be related also to legal questions.
Dear Chairman, please allow me to contribute as well to this discussion. Basically to bring in an additional bit of knowledge that abstracts for 1 second from the discharge problem, and we will look closely, or more or less closely, you can always refer to the paper later on, to the Council budget. So it's some consideration on the current ways in which the Council budget is subject to audit and oversight in order to see whether we can learn something from current practices and perhaps understand if there's something missing and some additional issues to be addressed. The Council has more or less an annual budget of 500 million for its administrative expenditure, 60% of which is usually allocated to cover for cost for staff and working experts and expertise. And I think that we have to be extremely clear with that, that there might have been somehow a sort of fear that included in this administrative expenditure there could be something strong that relates or pertain to non-purely administrative issues, but that there is absolutely not evidence of that. There is absolutely no evidence of misreporting. So what we can confirm is that the administrative expenditure from the side of the Council is administrative. So we can welcome to Chairwoman Gressler as well. Thanks for joining us. What we can certainly say is that there is no evidence of misreporting, that all the expenditure in the administration are administrative expenditure, but the problem is that there is absolutely no distinction, there is no split between administrative expenditure that are incurred in the legislative function and administrative expenditure that is instead incurred into more executive actions from the side of the Council. You may also be aware that the budget of the Council, as we speak of, it's a unique budget, so it doesn't distinguish between the two institutions. So I repeat, there is no distinction between the European Council and the Council of the European Union. Plus, there is no distinction in the budget of what pertains to administrative expenditure for the legislative or executive actions. We provide here for some numbers just to clarify how neat is the budget and how clear is to see that there is no evidence of misreporting. The problem being the identification, perhaps, of what type of administrative expenditure concur to the definition of an executive arm. And we present here with a list that the Council made available of all the meetings held in 2015. It's about 6,000 meetings. It's a huge list of meetings. And if you go through the list, you can almost immediately see that some of them, they might have a strong foreign policy component. For instance, the EU CELAC, or the summit with the Latin American and Caribbean states, it involved 61 delegations, was another summit in Valletta with 87 delegations, perhaps the Coreper tour with foreign policy, and out of the 1,300 other protocol events, some of which they may well refer to executive powers. Our point here is the following. The weight of the meetings in the budget of the Council is not particularly high. So the meetings, they said it's 1% of the total administrative costs and 4.2% of the operating costs. But just by having an understanding of whether the meeting is framed in the framework of a legislative or an executive objective could give us almost a clear picture of how to divide the entire operating expenditure, because all the other costs like interpreting and travel costs are linked to the type of meetings that we are running. So just by defining whether a meeting is executive or legislative, one could disentangle more or less clearly what type of operating expenditure is linked to legislative and which type is linked to executive. I would like also to mention that, of course, there is a matter of staff related involved here, because the Directorate for Conference and Protocol at the Council is organizing these 6,000 meetings. So we have not only the cost related to the meetings, but the cost also related to the staff. That is the 60% of the staff should be addressed. In particular, the annual activity report of the Council issued in 2016, referring to 2015, also clarified that the Directorate for Logistics was highly involved in this. So it means as well that perhaps some people and staff have been involved into this type of foreign policy related or executive powers related meetings. Another point, quite I hope relevant point that I would like to bring to the audience relates to the current framework for audit and oversight. At the moment, the most important and relevant instrument is provided by the Court of Auditors, thanks to the annual report. But there are some problems with this approach, both in terms of methodology and in terms of scope. So it provides only a very partial oversight and audit. Why? In terms of methodology, the annual report is based on sampling transactions and a rotational approach, meaning that, for instance, for the entire administrative budget of the Union, the transactions that are audited are about 150 a year. So which means per institutions are a very, very limited number, about 20 per institution. The second issue is that not every institution is covered every year. So the Council was covered in 2012, when actually some problems related to procurement were found, and after that it was not covered again. So the fact that the annual report of the Court of Auditor doesn't bring to light any problems related to the Council doesn't mean that there aren't problems. It can simply mean that it was not checked. So this is quite a relevant point, I suppose. But the other point, besides the methodology, which involves not a super relevant sampling, not a continuous control, it's based also on the type of control, in the sense of the scope, because the annual report of the Court of Auditors is focused on the respect of legal requirements and principles. So it will check whether the reporting has been done correctly. There's nothing that relates to performance-based budgeting in that type of report. So that's only, let's say, one little type of audit. It's not. It's a legal somehow requirement based. To fill this gap, however, the Court of Auditor can issue and does so special reports that actually focus much more not only on legal requirements but much more on the value for money that certain activities can bring. But the special reports that look at administrative expenditure are still very rare. So perhaps that we could think about encouraging these type of actions to be targeted more frequently to EU institutions. I conclude by stressing the three issues that the current audit and oversight system provided by the Court of Auditor is generally missing because of the points I mentioned before. The value for money, so the identification of performance budgeting issues, particularly in relation to staff and building, is not done yearly unless there is a special report, which has not been the case lately. Secondly, the oversight of the Court of Auditor is not really bringing information or double-checking whether the internal oversight of the Council is working, is in place, and there are concerns about it because it has been changed over time several times. Lastly, the Council had made a big effort, and the documents provided in 2016 and 15, they apparently define a new framework for internal audit. Hopefully it will remain such or even be strengthened, but there is no double check on internal oversight. And the third point is, of course, related to foreign policy actions. You've heard already from my colleagues. Just to mention that, for instance, the Council annual activity report also stressed the involvement of the country in military operations like the Athena mechanism, on which, of course, there is no. It is one transaction, so there is no way in which you can have thorough understanding or oversight through the annual report on implementation of the budget of the European Court of Auditors. Say that, I think that we are almost ready for some conclusions and perhaps some ideas for policy recommendation. I leave the floor to Professor Benedetto.
Thank you, David. So, to conclude, so there's no evidence used funds, but there is a question about the accountability and the use of those funds for policy. Now, the Council has stressed that it is part of a legislature. It's also stressed that it has security concerns in terms of what it makes available. Now, stressing security concerns is itself an executive rationale. A legislature usually has fewer security concerns. So the combination of its status as a legislature which shouldn't be accountable to another legislature, as well as security concerns, it would appear, underlie the Council's reticence to respond to parliamentary questionnaires within the ambit of the discharge procedure. As we've heard, the Court of Auditors may examine perhaps 6 files per year, since the Council takes only 6% of the administrative budget of the European Union. And so that is nothing like a full institutional audit. And there's also this question of the status of expenditure, which seems to be legitimately administrative, concerned with the salaries of council staff, the costs for buildings, and other administrative expenditure. It's all reported, but this expenditure is not quantified as being either for legislative or for executive purposes. And then finally, I'd add that there is a sense of asymmetry about how accountability works with the budget, and in particular with regard to the Council, because the annual budget of the European Union is voted or amended by the European Parliament, and in that case the European Parliament, when considering the annual budget, has 2 rapporteurs. One is responsible for Section 3 for the Commission's expenditure and that of the EU's agencies, and a second rapporteur is responsible for the expenditure of all the other institutions. So it's an institutionally based system, Commission for one rapporteur, everything else for the other rapporteur. The annual budget, after it's been spent, is examined by the Court of Auditors, which examines those accounts using 5 different chambers, each of which is responsible for a particular series of policies or headings within the budget. One of those 5 chambers is Chamber 5, which is the administrative expenditure chamber. And the Court of Auditors is examining annual expenditure and accounts on the basis of policy, whether it's external actions in Chamber 3 or administrative expenditure in Chamber 5. It's not examining the accounts on an institution-by-institution basis, which is the basis on which the Parliament had passed the budget. And finally, the Parliament decides to grant discharge or to withhold discharge based, again, on each institution. Each institution is considered for a discharge. Each EU agency is considered for a discharge. The Parliament does not grant a discharge for each policy. Instead, it's on an institution-by-institution basis. So there is an asymmetry there in the accountability system. So now to move on to recommendations. We have a number of recommendations which concern some of the institutions, including for the Parliament itself. But to start firstly with the Court of Auditors. This is an institution which is independent and whose independence has to be respected. We can see the advantage of a partial restructure of the Court of Auditors, although that would be an operational decision for the Court itself. But first of all, a special report undertaken by the Court of Auditors on the Council and on the European Council could be justified. Why could it be justified? Well, since 2009, as we've heard earlier, there's been some very significant change to the institution of the Council and the European Council. The Council has lost an element of its executive power, which has been moved to the European External Action Service. It's gained some new areas of responsibility with the appointment of the presidency of the European Council. And so there have been internal administrative and institutional changes within the Council itself. And when there is change of this kind, an audit, a special audit, could be justified to check the implementation of those changes and to make sure that the management is proceeding smoothly. In terms of the court's own structure, we note that Chamber 5, which is responsible for expenditure on administration of the Union, could be divided. The overwhelming proportion of administrative expenditure within the EU budget is exercised by the European Commission. There could be justification so that the other institutions, even the ones which are comparatively small, receive a legitimate and full audit, for Chamber 5 to be divided, or for some other restructuring to be phased in so that the administrative accounts of institutions other than the European Commission are examined in greater detail. And that could also follow action taken by Chamber 3, which is concerned with external action, security and justice, to focus in particular, or potentially through a special report, on files of the Council. Moving on to relations between the Parliament and the Council, of course a new modus vivendi could be considered, one of which was discussed a number of years ago, to replace the Gentleman's Agreement of 1970. The Gentleman's Agreement of 1970 is an agreement whereby the Parliament and the Council agree not to amend or interfere with each other's internal budgets. The Parliament views that as justified only for the annual budget in any case, and from a period in which the Council didn't exercise particular executive powers. And as far as the Parliament was concerned, the Gentleman's Agreement never really applied to discharge. An alternative, though, is a new interinstitutional agreement on which the Parliament or some members of the Parliament had been sceptical in the past. Such an interinstitutional agreement could introduce the principles of the Gentleman's Agreement, but the first important point to make is that this should be an agreement that would require the active renewal of both the Parliament and the Council, a sunset clause. It could be established to last for up to 7 years, as long as an MFF, and then on its expiry it would only continue if by a qualified majority the Council voted in favour of renewal and if the Parliament did likewise by majority. Just as an insurance in case one or other institution no longer wishes or no longer sees an advantage in that arrangement in order to facilitate agreement in the first place. And what would this interinstitutional agreement contain? Well, it would maintain the substance of the Gentleman's Agreement, but only for law-making expenditure. So the Parliament and the Council would open their documents to each other for the Council's recommendation and for the Parliament's discharge, concerned only with law-making expenditure. The interinstitutional agreement would then specify access to non-legislative expenditure by the Council, the access for discharge that the Parliament would gain to the Council's accounts and management documents of expenditure that is purely executive. In terms of what this means for the Council, one possibility is a division of Section 2 of the budget to recognise an institutional division between the Council and the European Council, and to consider a new section of the budget, as Section 11, for the Council's executive activities and for the European Council, with its own discharge, separate from the discharge for Section 2. In addition to that, or as an alternative, a further strategy could be that internal accounting, as well as the line-by-line budget for the Council, all headings or subheadings would be defined as either administrative, as either legislative or executive. Now, there will be buildings and indeed individuals, members of staff at the Council, that will work if they're individual staff members. They will work sometimes in executive policies, sometimes in legislative policies, particularly if they're logistical staff who are arranging meetings, or maybe they're interpreters or translators, or meeting rooms within the Council's premises, which can sometimes be used for executive or for legislative meetings. And so how do you label them? How do you categorize them as either executive or legislative? In a sense, a decision has to be made, and it could be decided that an individual's work in terms of the organisation of meetings could be 30% allocated to executive responsibilities and 70% allocated to legislative responsibilities in order to organise the expenditure on those new lines where there's a clear accountability for buildings, for building usage and for staff members according to either executive or legislative criteria. And what can the Parliament do? Well, it could negotiate annually, and I know that the other team has something to say about this, the content of the questionnaires. This could be negotiable with the Council. The questionnaires can be more focused. Secondly, the Parliament, as part of its new arrangement or new relationship, could allow the Council to gain oversight of its files so the Council can produce its recommendation for the Parliament's own discharge. And then finally, an amendment to the Rules of Procedure could be considered. Annex 4 of the Rules of Procedure details, this is the Parliament's Rule of Procedure, details the mechanism of the discharge as the Parliament sees it, and an article within the annex could be added, a new article, that would foresee an automatic vote to delay or reject a discharge for any institution that does not present its accounts to the Parliament or that does not complete the Parliament's questionnaire. Of course, the insertion of such an article would be a choice by a Parliament that wishes to confront the issue. But there have been precedents in the past, not concerned with discharge, but with other matters in the EU's framework, where the European Parliament has adopted rules of procedure that do foresee an automatic rejection. It has done this in the past with the Parliament's internal management of the codecision procedure. So finally, if disagreement continues, 5 years ago, Florent Chaltiel, who spoke to this committee, also made some rather hard suggestions in case Parliament's relations with the Council did not resume in a constructive way. The Council was of the view that only the Commission is responsible for the budget, and therefore only a vote of discharge should be granted to the Commission. That being the case, Florent Chaltiel suggested that the Parliament could use the vote of investiture in a new European Commission to extract cooperation, or could even threaten to censor the Commission in order to extract cooperation on the Council's budget. That's a far-fetched scenario. Other scenarios are for Parliament to pose questions, or parliamentarians to pose questions in the plenary to the Council and the Commission, and for committees of inquiry to be established. And indeed, there are already 2 committees besides this one that could ask questions about the Council's executive activities, and they are the Libe Committee and the AFET Committee. And then finally, Parliament in the annual budget has the right to amend the annual budget, and indeed in the past has as a tactic reduced expenditure within heading 4, and could do so also in parts of heading 3 where council involvement is likely. But again, these are tactics to pursue if harmonious institutional relations are not re-established. And therefore, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Ja, vielen Dank. Und wir sind jetzt.
Thank you very much. We're running a little late, so I'd like to continue immediately with Dr. Maria Luisa Sanchez Berrueco from the University of Deusto. Go ahead, madam.
I'm going to speak first of all, if you don't mind, Madam President. Madam President, Rapporteur, distinguished members of this committee, representatives from the Court of Auditors, dear colleagues. I'm Paul Stevenson, a researcher at the University of Maastricht. It's a pleasure to be here today as a co-convener of our research network on financial accountability in the European Union with my colleagues Maria Luisa Sanchez Berrueco from the Deusto Law School in Bilbao and Hartmut Aden from the Berlin School of Economics and Law. If I may just take a brief moment to introduce our group. The EU Finico Research Network gathers together 25 researchers from 14 member states, all working in accountability-related matters. Through the last 5 years, of close cooperation, we've built strong research capacities on financial accountability and its relation to an impact on the European Union's legitimacy, and there by which I mean the institutional legitimacy and the throughput legitimacy of the European policy process. We're very eager to bring together academics and practitioners together to work on research matters related to the performance of the EU budget. We're keen to foster a close working relationship with the European watchdog institutions and bodies, notably the European Court of Auditors. And I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that it's a great honour to talk to you today before this committee on budgetary control, which embodies this House's efforts for the improved accountability of financial management. Your committee plays an invaluable role in working to enhance the legitimacy of the Union before European citizens, that is the taxpayer, increasing citizens' trust in a well-functioning union, and we're grateful to take this opportunity to undertake research on your behalf on what is an extremely complex and delicate issue, and to offer scholarly, rigorous and hopefully independent advice in this matter. I now pass to Maria Luisa Sanchez Berrueco, who's going to present the main findings of our briefing note with perhaps more of a legal dimension. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Potential solutions for improving Council discharge represent the focus of the briefing I will present today. As my colleagues have previously introduced, the budget of the Council is small, proportionate to the whole EU budget, even to the administrative expenditure of other institutions. And furthermore, there is no evidence of mismanagement detected by the European Court of Auditors. However, there is no small gap in financial accountability, and there is no small organizational wrongdoing from the perspective of legitimacy. European citizens do not want to learn that a portion of the budget, however small, escapes the democratic accountability of the only European institution directly elected by them. In accountability, we are as strong as the weakest link of the chain. Therefore, finding solutions to Council discharge is an important matter. Three are the main ideas I would like you to retain from my presentation. First, that the current legal framework is affected by glitches that offer arguments supporting both the Parliament and the Council. These legal glitches prove our long-lasting impression that accountability is not a salient issue in treaty reform, that when an intergovernmental conference is convened, the political energy is invested in improving other sides of legitimacy, achieving a government that does more for the people or that represents better the European people, but not achieving a better functioning of government as such. This leads to my second key idea. The legal framework of budget accountability suffers from great inertia, but it is not set in stone. Certainly, effecting changes requires a political energy which is often missing because when the negotiations arrive, efforts are oriented towards more pressing issues. The good news is that changes have happened in the past and that can happen in the future, but someone must take on the task of advocating for them, preparing draft changes ahead of the moment and building alliances with the relevant actors. The last idea I wish to convey is that our briefing puts forward 4 main scenarios to break the interinstitutional deadlock over Council discharge, but all the 4 scenarios are suboptimal for one reason to another. So it's ultimately up to the Parliament to weigh their respective advantages and shortcomings and decide which one to follow. To solve the institutional stalemate, it is important to understand that the nature of the disagreement lies in different interpretations of the legal framework currently in force, none of which is necessarily flawed. To our understanding, neither the Parliament nor the Council are forcefully breaking the law. They only interpret it differently and act accordingly. The Council draws on a narrow interpretation of the legal framework as it is, while the Parliament supports its views on a broad interpretation of the legal framework as it should be. And I will come back to their respective legal arguments later on. It is not my intention to trace financial accountability and discharge back to 1951, for which I would kindly refer you to the briefing note, but I think that we can draw some lessons from the historical evolution. First, that the hierarchy of laws between the treaty, the financial regulation, and the remaining legal acts must be respected, of course, but in the past, changes to the legal framework have occasionally been advanced through the financial regulation, awaiting future treaty reform to crystallize them. When all the actors involved agree to those changes, there is no obstacle to use the financial regulation as a proxy. Second, we also learn that institutional practices have taken profit from gaps to introduce tiny tweaks in the legal framework that then become internalized and consistent to the extent that the remaining actors tolerate them, even if these practices seem to depart from the legal framework. This said, I will highlight here that neither the framework of budget implementation nor the one of discharge have remained completely unchanged. Regarding discharge, during the 1951 to 1958 period, a commission of representatives of all institutions, chaired by the President of the Court of Justice, ensured the accountability of budget implementation. Then, between 1958 and 1971, it was the Council alone who granted discharge. Between 1971 and 1977, discharge was a joint issue between the Parliament and the Council. And finally, since 1977, Parliament grants discharge upon recommendation of the Council. However, several provisions in the legal framework imply the existence still of a discharge authority as if Council and Parliament were placed on an equal footing. Another change over the years has been, is linked to the intermediate documents of discharge, which have been improved, and also the intervention of subjects other than the Commission has been progressively acknowledged in the legal framework. So it can safely be said that the legal framework can be changed if it doesn't ensure proper accountability. I would now like to refer to discharge as accountability mechanism, and to assess its effectiveness, we have considered the 4 dimensions of accountability in a democratic regime. So first, transparency may be passive in the sense of making budget-related documents available to the public, or active, reporting on budget implementation activities. The scope of reporting has broadened over time, and we consider that the Council fairly complies with both obligations. Nevertheless, the lack of separation between the Council and the European Council, which is justified for efficiency-related reasons, according to our conversations with external observers, it hampers the respective transparency of Council and the European Council. It is important to highlight that the Commission's involvement as regards administrative expenditures is to merely compile the information forwarded by the other institutions. The second dimension would be exposure as an obligation, for instance, for the Commission to answer questions raised by the European Parliament, although in practice all the remaining institutions but the Council accept to answer the questionnaires and participate in Parliament hearings. Whether the Council's attitude is lawful or not largely depends on the scope attached to Article 317 of the TFEU. Whether the expression "the Commission shall implement the budget" is understood as covering the whole budget or just its operational side. In my opinion, our only operational expenditure was in the mind of the treaty draftsmen when they wrote Article 317 TFEU. Therefore, they left open the question of administrative expenditure. But this issue might only be solved by the Court of Justice. In any case, the legal treatment of administrative expenditure here is a shortcoming, and the cooperation of the remaining institutions does not render it right. The third dimension of accountability is judgment, whereby the actors must bear criticism for their financial management. In this charge, criticism is passed through a recommendation of the Council and a decision by the Parliament, although the respective meaning and effects is left open under the current legal framework and should be further specified. The fact that the discharge decision is made public is beneficial because the targeted actor becomes the subject of lasting criticism that lasts over time and may be more prone to change its behavior. And finally, discharge does not allow for imposing sanctions other than soft ones, such as the obligation to report on follow-up measures, or else sanctions in collateral fields in which the Parliament wields power. I will now summarize the respective arguments of the Council and the Parliament, because both institutions use the legal framework or the gaps thereof to their advantage, and the common ground is that they both agree that the discharge procedure extends to the entire budget, covering the administrative expenditure of the Council too. The main disagreement is whether the Council should be controlled directly or through the intermediary of the Commission. The Council purports that the legal provisions on budget implementation in the treaty and the financial regulation cover the entire budget and the responsibility is attached to the Commission alone. But how can then the practical intervention of other institutions be justified? Here the Council draws on Article 55 of the Financial Regulation, establishing that the Commission confers powers on the other institutions for the implementation of their part of the budget. Conferral here is interpreted by the Council as a synonym for delegation, placing the other institutions in a similar position as national authorities in shared management or international organizations in joint management. They would be delegated according to the Council. They would be sort of delegates of the Commission who can never delegate responsibility for budget implementation. Another important argument of the Council focuses on the nature of individual decisions of discharge by the Parliament. Council argues that these are intermediate documents issued by the Parliament in order to prepare for the final decision on the Commission, which would not produce effects outside the European Parliament. This is a smart argument on the Council side, which cannot be challenged, given that the discharge decision does not actually produce practical effects other than the political ones, provided that the targeted body is responsive to Parliament's criticism. The view of the Council is a narrow one, which disregards the reality of implementation of administrative expenditure. This is reflected in Parliament's reasoning, from which I will only highlight two arguments because they are well known. First, that all institutions in practice, act as equal in budget management of their own funds. They appoint their own financial officers, They appoint their own internal auditors, and they entertain direct relations with the European Court of Auditors and the Parliament. The Commission is best involved in financial management, therefore it can issue guidelines on certain financial management or budget reporting, but it does definitely not play an intermediary role with the remaining institutions. The rest of institutions act as autonomous managing institutions that enjoy organic independence from the Commission. A second powerful argument to support Parliament's views is the one based on the distinction between conferral and delegation. Delegating authorities can always take their powers back. However, the conferral of other institutions or of the requisite powers to implement their part of the budget is imposed by the financial regulation and the treaty on the Commission. It is a permanent conferral and it is irrevocable. I see no delegation here, just a glitch in the legal framework. The ones conferring the powers to the institutions for administrative expenditure are the member states and the treaty, even though the treaty does not explicitly say so. And most importantly, we have noticed that there is a clear split between the different language versions of Article 55 of the financial regulation. Most language versions opt for the term conferral or a synonym, thus suggesting ownership by the Commission, who would then translate the power to the other institutions. But no less than 8 language versions are drafted in a way that the Commission acknowledges the power of other institutions. And among these second language versions that would give reason to the Parliament, we find the French one, the German one, the Spanish one, Finnish one. So the issue is far from clear, even in the legal framework. I will now explore the ways to solve the institutional stalemate. Because eventually it's the legitimacy of the Union as a whole which is at stake if a part of the Union budget escapes proper accountability. We have evaluated 4 scenarios. The interinstitutional one looks at measures that the European Parliament itself might take to improve discharge. The legal one looks at prospects for updating the legal framework. Then a third one would be referring the case to the Court of Justice. And finally, negotiating a revised agreement with the Council. And I believe that our arguments are rather complementary to the ones that have been put forward by my previous colleagues. First, the interinstitutional proposals suggest that the European Parliament might lead by example in financial accountability. It is worth recalling that budget implementation by the Council does not seem to be affected by mismanagement. And the European citizen will surely wish for a discharge authority that becomes a standard setter, a norm promoter in financial management, in transparency and accountability. And in this regard, the Committee of Budgetary Control has surely a role to play. Secondly, it is advised to improve the discharge questionnaires through introducing perhaps internal checks and balances that keep them as objective as possible, as sound as possible, as focused as possible. This links to the need to define better what the political dimension of financial accountability stands for. What's the added value of the work of the Parliament? In the briefing, we also suggest that the Committee on Budgetary Control enhances its awareness-raising activities on the importance of financial accountability to secure more effective leadership in interinstitutional negotiations. In the past, the lack of consensus inside the Parliament has arguably diminished the Parliament's effectiveness in negotiations with the Council. And lastly, Parliament might want to explore alliances with some members of the Council which are more prone to sound financial management to attract them to its views. Their support will be key in securing changes in the legal framework, which is our second proposal. Changes in the legal framework can be fostered using various procedures with varying results. The best options are the ordinary reform of the treaty or the financial regulation in which the EP, the European Parliament, has stronger powers. The shortcoming in the case of the treaty is that negotiations and ratifications take long and they are uncertain because many actors are involved, whereas changes to the financial regulation must respect the boundaries of the treaty or take advantage of its gaps. Other options, such as the annual budget or the internal rules of procedure, are also explored in the briefing note, but they seem inadequate for long-term purposes because they occupy the lower level in the hierarchy of laws. Which are the main topics in need of redress? First, whether the Council represents a discharge authority. If not, legal inconsistencies should be removed from the legal framework. As elaborated further in the note, the legal framework shapes a rather weak involvement of the Council throughout discharge, and institutional practice further reinforces this critique, with the exception of its nature of addressee of the financial package. So the time has maybe arrived to acknowledge the difference between the budget authority on the one hand and the discharge authority on the other, and to acknowledge that the European Parliament should remain the only forum in discharge. Secondly, the involvement of other institutions, including the Council, in budget management should be reassessed so that the legal framework and institutional practices are reconciled. As explained before, we reject that the nature of conferral and delegation are synonyms, drawing on a legal analysis of their respective nature, first, on the varying language versions of the financial regulations, second, and on respective institutional practices, third. So as regards administrative spending, all institutions are in practice independent managing authorities. In the case of the Council, however, the need arises to draw the line between its activities as manager and as executive, as our colleagues have pointed out before. Furthermore, when financial accountability draws on performance criteria, beyond legality and regularity, when financial accountability draws on performance criteria, a line should be drawn not to encroach upon the institutional autonomy of the other institutions. And that's a reflection task for the Committee on Budgetary Control. Further suggestions include measures to enhance transparency and reporting, for instance, on whistleblowers or on gender relationships, as well as the respective scope of the technical dimension of the financial accountability carried out by the European Court of Auditors and the political dimension carried out by the Parliament. It is not clear currently whether the Parliament draws on the European Court of Auditors, whether the Parliament can fill in the gaps left by the European Court of Auditors, and the mutual relations in view of a more adequate accountability. With regard to the third scenario, the seizing the Court of Justice for interpretation or for solving the interinstitutional stalemate, this is also a suboptimal scenario because the interpretation of the Court of Justice may not give reason to Parliament. Theoretically, the conflict might reach the Court of Justice through two ways. Either an action for failure to act, involving, for instance, the lack of cooperation of the Council if Parliament believes that there is a legal obligation to cooperate with Parliament, But there is no precedent of this action in Council-Parliament relations. There is no precedent of action for failure to act in Council-Parliament relations. Alternatively, the Council might bring an action for annulment against the individual discharge decision if it sees that it's wrongful from a legal perspective. But seizing that opportunity would mean acknowledging that the individual discharge decision has legal defects, which the Council denies. Even if I acknowledge that further research on interinstitutional legal proceedings is needed, but my preliminary assessment is that most cases in the past have concerned the legislative procedure and not policy measures. In the past, Parliament has initiated 50 proceedings against the Council. It won in 27 cases. 7 cases were rejected at the admissibility stage, and it lost in 16 cases. And then on the Council side, the Council initiated 4 cases, annulment proceedings against the Parliament. It won 3 of them, and the remaining one was lost. Therefore, the outcome of such action is uncertain. And finally, final words on negotiating a revised agreement, because this has been tackled in depth in previous interventions. The main shortcoming here is the reciprocity imposed by the Council, which represents a regression from the current legal powers acknowledged to the Parliament. This would, however, just to introduce an idea for the debate, reciprocity would, however, represent more a theoretical than practical shortcoming, given the scarce attention provided or attached by Council to this charge in practice. For the rest, the reflections included in the briefing note are oriented towards identifying common grounds, for instance, on values, and regulating interinstitutional conflicts before they appear through mutual exchanges and procedural conflict resolution measures. We also suggest that instead of aiming at a comprehensive agreement covering this charge, including issues that have already achieved a satisfactory level of accountability in practice, the Parliament focuses on actual gaps. For instance, negotiating with the Council answers to questionnaires that have been improved. I hope to have provided you with a comprehensible overview of the main issues at stake regarding Council discharge and the main avenues for its redress. Allow me to finish my presentation by recalling the importance of discharge for the legitimacy of the Union, that the eyes of the European citizens are set on the way in which the European Parliament holds the other organs to account, but also the way in which it implements its own share of EU funds, and that a bad solution is worse than no solution at all. Given the complexities of this topic, it might be advised to compromise with the Council while advancing sound proposals ahead of treaty reform in the future. We hope that our briefing note will encourage debate in this regard. Many thanks for your attention.
Herzlichen Dank. Sind Sie damit am Ende?
Thank you very much. Have you finished, or is Dr. Stevenson going to come back?
Professor Stevenson?
Nothing to add.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Vielen Dank. Waren sehr interessant.
Thank you very much for those interesting presentations. And the rapporteur is now going to ask the first questions.
Aan al diegenen die
Thank you very much to everyone who has presented the studies and the work. And that's very interesting because we can now look at those things in the round. I'm going to focus on solutions. And I was most interested in the second part, which went into this with very explicit suggestions, and I found that very interesting. I was an area which I'm particularly interested in, and which wasn't. This was, can we find a modus vivendi with Council? And we know that Council in 2011 put a proposal before Parliament. And the last speaker touched on that once or twice. And I just wonder if you could just elaborate on that. Starting on the basis of the Council proposal, how would, and with the full knowledge of everything that we've heard today, what would be the elements which Parliament can add in to ensure that Council's proposal would then be acceptable to Parliament and also acceptable to Council? Something else which was commented on in the presentations was the interpretation of how the discharge should be, what the background conditions for that. And that's where there are major discrepancies in the view of Council and in the view of Parliament. But we do have a text from Council, and I'd like to hear from you. What are the elements which might help us in our future discussions? But there may be other colleagues who want to chip in with their questions.
Yes, that's right. Would any other colleagues like to take the floor? No, apparently not. I have a comment that I'd like to make as well. It's interesting to look back at the history of the discharge procedure. We've never thought that there were any irregularities in the way the Council is administered. That's not something that we were interested in. It's nice on your slide where you have those two figures who look like two children who are annoyed with each other. We realise that we need to work on our questionnaires and make them more specific. The questionnaires have suffered from the fact that the financial regulation wasn't complied with. Now accounts have been published on the website. That happened a year ago, and we've been able to compare whether what we asked was actually there or whether it was partially there. The concern that operative policies, foreign policy is covered, that's something that we're constantly concerned about. And then it depends on the way that the perspective that we look at this from, to see whether we're looking at it from an emotional point of view, if I can put it like that. You're advising that we don't have a set rule at the moment because this is something that will be included in future treaty reform. If that happens, then we would be able to come up with some wording that could be considered in the negotiations. Really, it's such a straightforward issue that should be settled in a straightforward way, that as the EU we should be setting a good example. We asked the Council Secretariat about this and said if there's a new piece of information, if there's a new element, we can go to the Member States and discuss that. But could you give us any suggestions as to what those new factors could be? And Mr. Stilkowski.
Já jsem se chtěl zapojit původně do diskuze.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did not want to participate in the discussion because I didn't have a chance to listen to the presentation because we had a different important presentation on terrorism in Libya. However, regarding the discharge for Council, there is nothing really to discuss. If a European or any institutions, or even more so a European institution, is to be legitimate and is to be considered transparent vis-à-vis citizens, it must get discharge. It is not about the Commission or the Court of Auditors inventing work or wanting to examine something. It is not about us thinking that someone is stealing money or that everybody is lying, they're not doing things they should be doing and the processes are not functional. It's not about that. It is about an elected body like the European Parliament to be able to review, to discuss the situation and take measures so that any irregularities can be eliminated. And that is transparency, that is what we mean. Together with Ella Sanders and you, Madam Chair, and others, some of our advisors, we have visited the United States, and we were surprised that they do not have this procedure in the US. The procedures that we have here increases the credibility, or should increase the credibility of European institutions with the citizens. We are able to detect a number of issues during the procedure which may not be exactly fraud, but they are deficiencies. And if we want to have, are to have high expectations from someone, then we have to have high expectations from ourselves, first of all. And this is my opinion. I have frequently criticized the European Council here. I have said it is unbelievable and that they do not have discharge. Now we are looking for a solution, and I trust that together with the Secretary General of the European Council, together with political party representatives, a task force has been set up, and we will reach the situation that a discharge for the Council will be a standard part of annual discharge procedure for European institutions, and we will no longer have to answer to journalists whether or not the Council is transparent or not, and we will just be able to say yes, or possibly with a proviso.
Frau Kollegin Ayala Sender, bitte.
Ms. Ayala Sender. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Well, I recognise that it's an interesting possibility to go back over this and see what was decided years ago. There are a couple of things I'd like to pick up on, which Mr. Zdechowski mentioned. In how all of this came about with the Parliament and the Council, it would be interesting to know whether member states have similar discharge systems. I'd be interested to know whether that's something that exists in the two chambers of Parliament, something which then shows that the budget has been respected. And then I was wondering whether at a European level there's any formula that we could apply. Sometimes we have specific systems for European institutions because they're new, and that then has advantages and disadvantages. As the chair said, sometimes there's an emotive background to all of this. So I was wondering whether there's any kind of formula that the experts could suggest, whether there have been other confrontations between the two wings of government in member states, And then I'd like to refer to something that Ms. Sanchez-Barrueco mentioned in terms of fairness. That's something that we've mentioned many times. The Parliament wants to assert its legitimacy as being the institution that can give the discharge, and it's done that many times. Before we take any steps, though, we should think about whether we could take a case to the Court of Justice. And if we did that, we might lose a lot of the ground that we've gained. In the treaty, the obligation that we have to give a discharge is for the Commission, and then we have achieved, because of the transparency in the European institutions and the work within this committee, that we could extend that discharge. But if we were to take a case, perhaps the Court of Justice would tell us that we'd gone too far and we run the risk of losing. Many times that's been suggested as a potential solution to then assert the legitimacy of Parliament in this area. So I was just wondering if you had some ideas about how we could bring this to a satisfactory result on the basis of what you were saying before. Thank you.
Ja, genau. Aber interessant wäre schon mal so.
Well, it's interesting. It would be interesting to see a full report from the court on this. Who would like to answer the questions?
Herr Professor Adler.
Okay, ich fange gerne an und der.
I'll start then, and then my colleague Dr. Benedetto will answer Mr. Starter's questions. First of all, on your questions, Chair. Here it's a matter of how we can deal with a very long-lasting conflict. This is something that we've set out in detail in our briefing notes, that this is something that dates back a long time. And it's interesting to see how the historical framework has changed over that time. Over the years, the Council has been doing a lot more in the executive area than it did in the 1970s, and other historical conditions have changed as well over time. That's something that's present in both of our papers, and how it's affected accountability. Dr. Sanchez-Barrueco has talked in detail about accountability. First of all, there's that first stage of transparency. If you don't create transparency, then it's very difficult for the rest of the system to work in order to be able to request information or to improve the system. Transparency then is a crucial element. We haven't seen any evidence at all that there's any misuse of the budgetary resources in the accounts, but we can definitely understand the argument on the basis of a lack of transparency that any type of withholding information creates an atmosphere of mistrust, not just for the members of this committee, but for the public at large. In terms of the historical context, I have the impression that we're seeing the vestiges of the Council as an intergovernmental organisation, that the Council is trying to protect its independence as a player in the European framework, as it did over many years. And we can see that in other areas as well, in justice and home affairs. Even though that's something that's completely encompassed in the European framework, the structure still has been shaped by the intergovernmental nature. I would then really encourage you to deal with this in future treaty reform, to put it on the agenda there. That would be an opportunity to look at the distribution of powers between the EU institution, which goes far beyond what we're talking about here.
Professor Benedict.
Thank you. So from what I've understood, the question is asking what can be the ingredients of a council proposal that would be acceptable to Parliament. And this is really a question that takes us back to the proposed modus vivendi in 2011. The Parliament was of a view that this was unreasonable. Now, the discharge procedure has various sources. We have the treaty, and in particular Article 319 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and we have the financial regulation, and indeed the Parliament's own rules of procedure, Rules 93, 94, and Annex 4. The procedures in the treaty are clear, that the Council recommends. And so for the Council to be able to recommend, if it's a partnership where each institution is providing the necessary information, part of that recommendation is a recommendation by the Council on the Parliament's very own discharge, as well as Council's recommendation on its discharge, on the discharge to Section 2. And this is really the spirit in which a new agreement needs to be entered into, whether it's a non-enforceable modus vivendi or something which is going to be put into law via an interinstitutional agreement is a separate issue. I take note of the concerns expressed that such norms perhaps should be avoided, setting fast or firm rules need to be avoided. Whilst the Parliament would be waiting to see if there's going to be any reform to the treaties, because it's possible that treaty reform will emerge over the next years, or perhaps it won't. This is a matter for us not to know for certain. But certainly if an interinstitutional agreement is reached rather than purely a new gentleman's agreement, I would very strongly urge a sunset clause so that it can naturally expire, and that's as an insurance for the Parliament in case the application of an agreement doesn't work out in exactly the way that the Parliament would have wished. One of the other questions asked if Member States have their own discharge systems. Some of them do, others don't. How Member States pass their own national budgets, the methods of accountability that exist within each one of the 28 Member States are very, very different. There are some aspects of the institutional architecture of the European Union that are inspired since the foundation by either a French model or a German model. What we know is that the European Union budget, even in the early days of European integration, we're going back to the 1950s, was something distant. It was something over which founding member states had some doubts. And when the European institutions were put into place, and later on when they were reformed and changed, and I'm particularly thinking of the agreement of 1970, the European Parliament in 1970 was given some power over the budget for the first time. It was given the right to amend the budget. In 1975, it was given the power, the exclusive power to grant discharge, albeit on a recommendation from the Council. The Treaty of 1975 also established the Court of Auditors as an institution. So these particular steps, parliamentary amendment of the budget, parliamentary right to grant discharge, the Court of Auditors, these were put in place not because the Member States had some concern about a democratic deficit. The rationale of the member states at the time was that going along a path of European integration, creating a larger budget, harmonising in other ways, they couldn't be certain of the outcomes of those changes. And so giving some power to the European Parliament or creating a Court of Auditors allowed a check and balance, the institution of somebody in the form of the European Parliament who could say no if European-level institutions like the Commission overreached their powers or acted in ways that hadn't been foreseen. So the creation of the discharge procedure, and indeed many of the powers given to the European Parliament in the early stages, were designed as a form of an insurance mechanism by member states that were uncertain of the consequences of European integration and feared that there may be some negative impacts. It was to safeguard against the potential negative impacts of European integration.
Yeah.
It's probably my turn. I would like to add a few comments to what Mr. Benedetto has said on prospect interinstitutional agreement or modus vivendi. As it will be stressed in the final version of the briefing note, a strong focus on common values would be interesting to make values that have been introduced by the Lisbon Treaty explicit in the text of the revised modus vivendi, because these values are binding for both participating institutions. And for instance, issues of transparency, issues of openness, and even good administration is a fundamental right now acknowledged in the Charter for Fundamental Rights, which is binding for all institutions that didn't exist when the former agreement or interinstitutional consensus was built. So the current scenario is different, so let's enshrine those new values into a revised interinstitutional agreement. Further proof of objectivity could be to, if the two institutions agree to call for a greater involvement of the Court of Auditors in administrative matters, which seem now a bit disregarded in the sea of operations in the budget. And then I would suggest to evaluate seriously if conceding to reciprocity is that serious, given that actually the Council is doing very little with the information it receives in the framework of financial management. So having the Council evaluating the financial implementation of the Parliament and in exchange getting to evaluate the financial administration of the Council, I believe that the Parliament has more to gain, because to achieve the same level of scrutiny, the Council would have to implement new procedures that are not in place currently. So it will be advised to assess from a rational perspective what the Council actually would do with reciprocity and what the Parliament might do with reciprocity. On the questions by Mrs. Grasle, the final version of the briefing note will include a summary of draft legal changes, in our humble opinion, that might serve as a pitch for debate within Parliament. I think that the reality is not reconciled with the legal framework as regards financial management by other institutions. And Article 55 of the financial regulation could be easily modified by stating, for instance, for instance, Article 55 currently says the Commission shall confer on the other institutions. That could be easily fixed by saying institutions other than the Commission are conferred the requisite powers for the implementation of the sections of the budget concerning to them. Because actually it's the member states who are conferring powers on the other institutions. So this is an example of tiny tweaks that could be introduced in the legal framework, and you will find them, our proposals in the final version of the briefing note. You also pointed out about the questionnaires, and I just wanted to add informally that even myself, as an independent observer, I was shocked by the tone used in several past questionnaires. I think that some specific questionnaires did not help building interinstitutional trust. And this is maybe because of the lack of internal procedures allowing to ensure that the rapporteur's position is counterbalanced by a different member of the House. And that's easy to put in place. Just organize a proceeding whereby anything that is forwarded to other institutions stick to the basic rules of interinstitutional courtesy. Then Mrs. Ayala asked about national formula. I cannot answer that question, unfortunately. On the question on the Court of Justice, to my current understanding of interinstitutional judicial proceedings, I would say that seizing the Court of Justice for interpretation would complicate further the issue. But the final version of the briefing note also includes a more expanded section on the interinstitutional conflict before the Court of Justice. And then I would like to add something on the difference between executive functions of the Council and managing functions of the Council of its internal budget. Because my colleagues have pointed out, and I totally agree with that the Council has expanded over recent times, and especially after the financial crisis, its executive functions. But allow me to recall that the task of this chart, or the purpose of this chart, is to scrutinize the financial management. So part of this interinstitutional trust is built when the Committee on Budgetary Control uses this chart to scrutinize other institutions on grounds of the impact of their activities on the budget. But forgive my expression, but when one sees that the power to discharge is enjoyed or exerted to criticize the other institutions in aspects that maybe do not have a clear link to the budget, to budget implementation, and in matters where the Parliament lacks scrutiny and monitoring powers, this fuels interinstitutional distrust. And in the longer run, it affects negatively the negotiating position of the Parliament. So an internal debate will be interesting to draw a clear dividing line between what has an actual impact on the budget and what hasn't. And then to try and be as respectful as possible to that link. But the truth is that for the time being, the competences of power in budget scrutiny are defined on the basis of its target, the Commission. Here there is a clear difference with the Court of Auditors, whose competence, whose powers are defined on the basis of the link to the EU budget. It might be interesting to reflect ahead of treaty reform whether it is possible to ensure that to achieve a different situation in which the competences of the Parliament during discharge are established on the basis of a link to the EU budget or an impact on the EU budget. That will align the Parliament's competences, the Parliament's powers with those of the Court of Auditors and make the whole system more consistent. But this, of course, implies a big change in the current system, which will require an enormous amount, I think, of political energy.
Ja, vielen Dank. Sie haben mir jetzt schon.
Well, yes, the tone of the questionnaires, that's something that I'm attached to, but we always have to have these questionnaires in English, and different people speak English at different levels. And English is a very polite language, and we're not all masters of it as we would like. The other alternative is a translation, but we want to save time and costs. So that's just an explanation. Yes, all the note takers will be happy. I just wanted to say that, though. I'm not saying anything about anybody's level of English, but it is a problem for us with these questionnaires. I'm not removing any importance from what you said. On the contrary, it's important for us. We're trying to standardise it to get to relieve some of the pressure on the office staff on getting the questions together from the different Commission reports. And the discharge procedure is about 12,000 pages of documentation. 12,000 page documents are what we have to look at and examine under discharge, and not everyone is happy about that. Any comments from the speakers? If not, then thank you very much. Before I allow Bart Stas to summarise and conclude, we're very interested in finding a solution. We're very interested in this. This is something that's been around for a long time. So thank you very much for everything you said. And Bart Stas, you have the last say.
Dit was een werkwinkel.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Well, that was, I think, very interesting. All of the presentations were very useful and interesting in the second round as well. A number of questions were answered. How the Parliament might seek progress in its discussion with Council. I don't want to jump to conclusions now, but we will be. That will be very useful for the process involving all of the political groups. I think that was 2 hours well spent. We're waiting, of course, for the final report. My question is, when can we expect that? That must have been in the contract, actually. There must have been stipulated. When can we expect the final version? I know that you've flagged up certain things which are on their way, which may be of use to us in our discussions with Council, so I look forward to that. So thank you very much, everyone. And I think that will help us in our quest for a solution. Thank you.
Kriegen wir noch eine Antwort auf die Frage?
Can we have an answer to that question?
On our side, we will need some 2 weeks more.
Yes, I imagine a timescale of that kind. I'd like to conclude by thanking once again the committee members and staff for this invitation. It's been a great honour, and I hope that our input will have been helpful to you.
Ja, herzlichen Dank. Thank you very much. Damit sind wir am Ende der
Thank you. This brings us to the end of
beim Koordinatorentreffen.
This is the end of the public meeting. And so we're now going to meet among coordinators. So anyone else that doesn't need to be there is now free to go. But I close this part of the meeting. Thank you.